Today I'm going to take a look at the Marin Nicasio Plus, a bike that is low on price, but is it high on fun? Find out what I like and dislike about it in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're into the non-competitive side of cycling, gravel, exploring, bike touring, the supple life, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. And hey, before we get started, if you guys like this content, consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon, where you get a ton of supple perks off of some really cool brands like Swift Industries, Reload Bags, Velo Orange. It's really a awesome collection of discounts for channel supporters like you, or potentially like you. So sign on. So I know I have a tendency to review kind of spendier bikes on the channel. That's usually because the ride qualities I'm looking for you don't usually see in less expensive bikes. But that may change today. So the Marin Nicasio Plus is a chromoly frame and fork, and it uses the Marin Series 1 chromoly tubing, so that means that it's not heat treated, so a little bit heavier, but you really can't expect heaven on earth for this price. So moving from front to back, the first thing you'll notice is that it's got 650B wheels and tires with the ever ubiquitous WTB Horizons. A nice and supple tire and something nice to see at this price point. The handlebars aren't labeled, but they do have a nice shallow drop, a little bit of flare that's kind of par for course for gravel bars these days. The shifters are by Microshift and it's their Advent line. So it's 9-speed. You do actuate it with paddles. Big paddle moves you into the lower gears, and the smaller paddle button jumps the gears down to the higher gears. I have to say, they don't have the refinement of a more expensive group set, but it works. It gets it into gear. A little bit with a kerchunk when you're shifting gears, but man, it's been super reliable. This is connected to Tektro Mira brakes, which were okay, not my favorite brake, but again, you're not gonna get heaven on earth for this price point. Fork does have eyelets for a rack and fenders. Moving to the middle of the bike, you get, your standard bottle cages. Crank is 1x and it's applied by FSA. It's got a 42 tooth chainring up in the front. On the rear of the bike, again, you've got a Advent rear derailleur, and most interestingly, it actually uses a Sunrace rear cassette, 11 to 46 in 9 speeds. Great range, a bit jumpy, but I actually found it worked out okay. In terms of functionality on the rear of the bike, again, it's got fender mounts and also mounts to run a rear rack. So all this you see before you costs the princely sum of $850 MSRP. So definitely not the cheapest bike out there on the market, but it's coming from a well-known brand. And I have to say, it's been working out pretty good. On our scales, the bike weighs, without pedals or cages or anything, at about 28 pounds. Definitely not on the light side, but we will get more into that later in the video. So enough of the component list. How does the bike ride? Well, I will tell you it is surprisingly fun. Although this bike has a budget price point, I feel like it doesn't have that entry-level kind of snooze fest geometry. Typically, in my experience, when brands create a budget bike, they make some assumptions on the kind of riding that they'll want to do, so they tend to make it a little bit slower steering, not as quick to accelerate, and that is not what is going on with this bike. On Bike Insights, the trail comes into the low 60s, so definitely a little bit more on the responsive side. I wouldn't say it's a twitchy, quick bike. It does respond a little bit quicker than some of the more modern gravel bikes that we're seeing. So not super slack, still maintains kind of a road endurance front end. So moving to the rear of the bike, this is where things get interesting. The rear chainstay length is 420. And if you look at our bicycle flavor wheel, that usually translates into a very quick and responsive and fun climbing bike. And amazingly, it works for this budget bike as well. That said, there are limitations, namely the weight and the components. It has that jumpiness and responsiveness that I like from a good climbing bike, but it is bogged down once the road goes uphill. But if you're riding on flat land, it's fairly easy to get up to speed. It's very responsive in the front. It is just a fun handling bike. And when you couple that with the big 650B tires, you do approach a truly supple and fun bike at a pretty budget-friendly price point. I think the shifters, while not sexy at all, let's get that straight, worked perfectly well. I thought it provided a good range. Once it was dialed in, it was clicking into gear and out of gear pretty reliably. And I know some people are gonna poo-poo the 9-speed cassette in the back, but personally for me, I didn't find it a problem. I'm not super sensitive to cadence. And as long as a bike has adequate range, I can usually deal with larger jumps. So kudos to Marin for sticking an 1146 back in there and making it a bike that is truly capable of climbing some steep stuff. I'm also stoked that this bike came 650B OEM. There wasn't any of the 650B compatible, and then you have to buy an extra wheel set, tires, all that stuff. I think it makes perfect sense for this bike. It kind of softens up the generally stiff feeling frame. I've ridden lots of steel bikes. This I wouldn't classify as, a very supple or compliant frame. Not when you're comparing it to things like the Crest Bambora or the Ritchie Outback. Said, the tires do make a big difference and really smooths out the ride. So what are the things that I like and dislike about this bike? The first big like is that it's got a fun geometry. It's not dumbed down just because it's an inexpensive bike. It's got the rough DNA of sportier bikes, that cost 3 or 4 times as much. So if you're on a budget but still want a fun and capable bike, I think the Nicasio Plus is one to seriously look at. Another big like is actually the Micro Shift Advent brifters and rear derailleur. This is really cool that you can rock 9-speed again and get that wide range. There's not going to be any confusing this with the same experience you would get with 105 or Dura-Ace, but it works, it gives you the range, and so far when I've been using it, the shifting has been really reliable. And of course I like the 650B tires. I feel like it softens up the whole kind of general ride experience and also makes it more capable for taking it off-road. And lastly, one big like is the price point. At under 900 bucks, you get a fun bike with 650B tires with appropriate gearing from a reputable brand. I think in some ways this is kind of the bike that the Aventon Quixote, you remember that bike, tried to be, but Marin actually pulls it off and executes it well. So that's what I like. What don't I like? 2 things. One is the weight. Again, it is quick and responsive, but you do feel it going uphill. That's when the realities of the price point and the components literally weigh you down. I think it makes a good platform. There are certainly ways to lighten it up by changing out the handlebars, the seat post. I think the biggest improvement you could do to this bike is probably swapping it out to a lighter wheel set. But of course, by that time, after you've sunk in that money, you might as well have gotten a different bike. So ultimately, what this bike reminds me of is the Midnight Special. If you want a Midnight Special, but that's not affordable enough for you, then this would definitely be a good bike to consider. It's got the big clearances, it's quick because it is fairly budget friendly. It leaves you lots of room for upgrades down the line. I think generally it would make a good platform for upgrades if you're truly on a budget. So I have to say, guys, I don't usually get excited about bikes, under $1,000, but for the money, this has to be the most fun budget bike I've ridden so far on the channel. So if you're looking for something that's budget friendly, that has supple tires, that isn't a boring ride, definitely check out the Marin Nicasio Plus. But that's what I think. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Leave your questions. I'll try to answer them. And again, if you like this content, support the channel by joining us on Patreon. You get lots of sweet, supple perks. And as always, keep the supple side down.